They said, the Ashworth house never cooled after that night. Even when the chimneys died and the windows froze from within, the air inside stayed hot, heavy, and wrong. And if you listened long enough, you could still hear the bell that never existed. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The year was 1834, and the Ashworth plantation, called Briar Hollow, sat 10 miles south of Vicksburg, Mississippi, surrounded by cypress swamps that seemed to sweat even in winter. The soil there was as black as tar and nearly as hungry. No one who lived on that land for long escaped its appetite entirely. Neither the enslaved nor the masters. Colonel Silas Ashworth had built his fortune on cotton blood and the illusion of civility. His home was all carved walnut and imported brick, a testament to control masquerading as gentility. His wife, Eleanor, was 20 years his junior, with a mind sharp enough to cut glass and a beauty that made the colonel feel both proud and suspicious. She'd been educated in Charleston, music, languages, anatomy in the abstract sense, and she carried that education into the Delta like a candle into a cave. By midsummer, everyone at Briar Hollow knew she was with child. The colonel, who measured life in inheritances, was pleased. His foreman, Mr. Henning, wrote in the household ledger that Mrs. Ashworth had taken to her confinement quietly and without complaint. But the midwives whispered otherwise. Her sickness was not like other women's, her cravings unnatural, her moods unearthly. She spent hours at her escritoire writing letters no one ever saw posted. Sometimes, at night, the driver Josiah was seen leaving her window. Josiah was not like the other men in the quarters. He could read and write, a dangerous gift granted long ago by one of the colonel's eccentric cousins. He was strong, careful, and spoke to the mistress as if she were a fellow human being rather than a delicate ghost. It was said that he'd once been a preacher among his own people, before the colonel had forbidden such gatherings. The colonel, of course, noticed everything. He had the temperament of a tax collector and the imagination of a man who'd spent too long suppressing it. When he looked at his wife, he saw lineage. When he looked at Josiah, he saw potential rebellion. But that summer, what preoccupied him most was not suspicion but pride. He'd been corresponding with physicians in New Orleans about a curious phenomenon recently described in European journals. A condition called superfecundation, in which twins might be conceived by two different fathers. The notion fascinated him. One womb, two seeds, separate bloodlines entangled in a single birth. He spoke of it once, over brandy, to Mr. Henning. The overseer had laughed awkwardly and changed the subject. Yet, when Eleanor began showing signs of twin pregnancy, the colonel mentioned the theory again, this time with an edge of ownership. He said it like a prophecy fulfilled. Eleanor, confined to her upstairs room, filled her journal with quiet desperation. The entries that survived were found much later, brittle and brown around the edges, some smudged as if by tears or water. One page read simply, "If both are born alive, I will name one for the river and one for the fire, and I will pray that neither belongs wholly to this house." By September, the entire plantation had fallen into a strange hush. Work continued, cotton picked, bales pressed, but the laughter and singing that sometimes drifted from the quarters at night had stopped. Even the cicadas seemed quieter. Henning kept to the main house after dark, claiming he heard voices near the barn that didn't sound like any he knew. The colonel dismissed it as nerves. Eleanor's condition worsened, fainting spells, fevers, long stretches where she stared at nothing. The physician from Natchez called it nervous exhaustion of the womb. He prescribed rest, laudanum, and prayers. But one woman in the quarters, Dinah, who had served as midwife for 20 years, said the trouble was not medical. She said the mistress was divided in spirit, that she had invited two men into one place where only one should live. For saying that, she was beaten and kept from the main house for weeks. Still, she returned the night the labor began. It was the last week of October, the air electric with the promise of a storm. Around midnight, Eleanor's pains came hard and fast. Henning fetched Dina from the quarters, despite the colonel's protests, and soon the upstairs bedroom filled with the low, rhythmic sounds of childbirth, the moans, the basin water, the whisper of linen. Outside, the enslaved families sat awake, eyes turned toward the great house where every light was burning. Josiah, unable to keep still, made his rounds under the guise of inspection. At each cabin, he repeated a single sentence in a low voice. "Be ready when you hear the bell." There was no bell at Briar Hollow. Everyone knew what he meant. Inside the house, time warped, hours bent and folded like paper. At 2 in the morning, Eleanor's screams grew so loud that even the colonel could not ignore them. He waited in his study, glass in hand, counting the minutes between each cry like a man waiting for a verdict. At 3:15, Dinah announced the first birth. A boy, small, pale, loud. The colonel heard the cry from below and allowed himself a smile. An air healthy. But the screams did not stop. At 3:47, a second cry pierced the storm. Another boy larger, also strong. Yet when Dinah cleaned him and held him to the lamplight, she froze. His skin was darker, caramel, unmistakable, even under the flickering light. His hair curled where his brother's was fine. His eyes, when they opened, were brown. Eleanor saw the midwife's face and knew before a word was spoken. She demanded to hold them both. Dinah hesitated, then obeyed. In Eleanor's arms, the two infants looked like mirror images reversed by God himself. One fair, one dark, both crying for air. The room went silent. When the colonel entered moments later, still dressed, still holding his whiskey, the silence deepened. He approached the bed like a man approaching a battlefield already lost. 2 sons. Eleanor whispered. Twins. He studied the first with approval, then turned to the second. The pause that followed felt like eternity catching its breath. Whose is he? Eleanor tried to speak, but her throat failed her. The words came out as a whisper that sounded like confession. Josiah. The colonel did not strike her. He only nodded, as if confirming an account entry. Then coldly, then he will hang. Dina gasped. Sir, please, get out, he said. Tell no one what you saw. If a single word of this leaves this room, you'll follow him. She fled. Eleanor clutched both infants to her chest, trembling. Please, she begged. It was my doing, not his. He followed my order. The colonel turned toward the window, his profile lit by the lamp's dull flame. A slave who touches a white woman dies. That's not cruelty. That's order. Then hang me too. He looked back at her, eyes glinting like steel in lamplight. No. You'll live. In a place where people like you belong. The doctors in Natchez will call it hysteria brought on by childbirth. You'll say you imagined it all. He poured another drink. And this one? He nodded toward the darker child. Will be gone by morning. The riverboats pay well for boys that young. The other, he touched the fair infant's cheek, will bear my name. Eleanor, bleeding and delirious, screamed and struck at him. The babies wailed. The commotion shook the rafters. And then, impossibly, through the storm and the firelight, came the sound of a bell. A slow, heavy tolling that rolled across the fields. There had never been a bell at Briar Hollow. The colonel froze. Dinah, down in the yard, dropped her pail. Out in the quarters, figures rose from their doorways, silent, waiting. The bell tolled again. And again. The rebellion had begun. The fire had not yet come, and the house still breathed as it always had, slowly, as though drawing air through dust and history. But the balance had shifted, imperceptibly, on that sweltering June afternoon in 1847 when the physician left the parlor and refused to meet Colonel Harlow's eyes. Dr. Merritt's carriage rattled away down the Magnolia lined drive, leaving behind a silence that pressed against the windows. Upstairs, in the nursery, 2 infants lay side by side, and anyone who entered that room, anyone with eyes that still functioned properly, would have understood that something unnatural, or at least inexplicable, had occurred. One child's skin held the faint, translucent paleness of wax. His father's features sharpened into miniature, his tiny fists already clenched in quiet possession. The other was darker, unmistakably so, though his hair gleamed copper, red where the light touched it. Their eyes, still forming, seemed to move in opposite rhythms, one alert, one dreaming. They cried in alternating breaths, as though some rhythm passed between them. Catherine Harlow sat beside their cradle, motionless. Her body was ruined from childbirth, and her mind was half, floating somewhere above the floorboards. Beneath her, the boards whispered, carrying sound between rooms as they always had, secrets passing through the wood like veins of water through limestone. Downstairs, Connell Harlow paced. His boots traced the same arc across the rug, each turn more violent than the last. The doctor's words had been vague, cautious. He had said it happens sometimes, nature's curiosities, the blood mixing in ways we do not yet understand. But his tone betrayed the lie. He had left the house with his bag half packed, his eyes fixed on the floor, unwilling to linger among those whose ruin he had just witnessed. Catherine knew the Connell's rage was coming. She had felt its approach in the shifting air, like the electricity before a storm. It was not the sort of anger that erupted and vanished. It calcified, grew intelligent, began to calculate. By evening, he had locked himself in his study. The servants heard drawers opening, ledgers thudding, the clink of decanters. He was counting, as he always did when his power felt threatened, counting the names of those he owned, the acreage, the bushels of cotton, the barrels of sugar. Numbers steadied him. They reminded him of hierarchy, of his place above and others' places below. But none of the ledgers could reconcile what had happened upstairs. That night, the first whisper began. It came from the nursery, so soft Catherine thought it might be the wind. She rose from the chair, every muscle trembling, and listened. Both infants had fallen silent, their breathing shallow and synchronized. The room smelled of milk, blood, and candle smoke. Then, just beneath the sound of their breaths, she heard it, the faintest hum, like air moving through the hollow of a bone. When she leaned closer, she realized the sound was coming from beneath the floorboards. Magnolia House was old, older than its plaster walls suggested. The foundation stones were taken from the ruins of an even older dwelling, some colonial structure that had burned long before the Harlows claimed this land. The slaves who rebuilt it said the stones hummed when touched, that they remembered the dead. Catherine had dismissed it as superstition once. Now she wasn't so certain. She knelt on the floor beside the cradle, pressing her ear to the boards. Beneath the grain, beneath the sighing of the river wind, she heard something human, a low murmur, almost like a voice repeating the same phrase. But the words dissolved each time she tried to grasp them. By morning, she convinced herself it was fever. When the colonel finally came to her room, he did not greet her. He carried a ledger under his arm, one of the older ones, leather scabbed with age. He set it on her writing desk and opened to a page near the middle. Names filled it, handwritten, ordered by birth date and value. The ink had faded, but one entry had been circled in fresh graphite. Solomon, age 24, carpenter, literate, valued at $800. Catherine stared at it without speaking. "You know what this means," he said quietly. "You know whose name this is?" Her throat constricted. The walls seemed to lean inward, listening. "I know," she whispered. "I have given you everything," he said. His tone was flat, restrained, more dangerous than if he had shouted. "This house, this land, your dresses, your meals, all of it comes from me, from my work, from my command." Catherine said nothing. She was thinking of the nights when Solomon had been sent to repair the staircase. The way his hands had moved with silent precision. The smell of cedar following him like shadow. She had told herself it meant nothing, that the brief touch of his hand when he steadied her was accidental. She had lied to herself beautifully. The colonel turned another page. "I will not be made a spectacle," he said. Do you understand me? There will be no gossip, no whispers among the servants, no rumors traveling downriver. I will handle this." She looked up. "Handle it how?" He didn't answer. That afternoon, Solomon was gone. No one saw him leave. Some said he'd been sold quietly to a buyer in Louisiana. Others whispered he'd been taken out past the bayou and buried where the water never recedes. Catherine asked questions, but each one earned her silence or pitying glances. The house grew colder after that. Even the sunlight that filtered through the tall windows seemed thin, brittle. The twins slept most of the time, one restless, one unnervingly still. When Catherine held them, she swore she could feel a pulse pass between them, as though they shared one heart moving between two bodies. At night, she began writing again, small notes in her old journal, describing what she saw and heard. The handwriting grew uneven, the lines breaking mid-sentence. June 22, 1847. He watches the pale one more closely. The darker child he ignores. I think he means to send him away. The house smells of lye again. The nurse won't look at me. June 23. The hum is stronger. The boards move under my feet when I walk near the nursery. I can feel something beneath the floor, like breathing. The twins sleep in the same rhythm now. I wake to find their fingers interlocked. The colonel ordered new locks for the upstairs doors. He told the servants it was to prevent thieves. But Catherine knew the truth. He feared what lived under his own roof. By the week's end, his behavior turned erratic. He began inspecting the nursery at all hours, measuring the children's features, muttering about inheritance and proof. At supper, he questioned the wet nurse about the color of the infant's eyes. Whether she had ever seen such a thing, she crossed herself and refused to answer. The same night, Catherine found a section of the floor in her room disturbed. 3 boards, pried loose near the hearth. Beneath them, wrapped in linen, was one of the colonel's ledgers, not the same one as before, a smaller, older book. When she opened it, she discovered names written in a different hand. Fewer entries, each accompanied by dates of birth and notes on bloodlines. The handwriting was her husband's, but the language chilled her. Words like mutation, lineal contamination, experimental breeding. Catherine realized slowly that Solomon's removal had not been punishment. It had been containment. That night, she dreamt of water flooding the hallways, the ledgers dissolving into ink, the voices beneath the floorboards rising, until the whole house seemed to whisper her name. When she woke, the hum had grown louder. One of the twins was crying, not the pale one. The other, his small face flushed, his limbs jerking in the air. She lifted him, and for the first time, she saw something she could not explain: faint marks along his arms, pale against the darker skin, as if his veins were glowing faintly beneath the flesh. She touched them. They were warm, pulsing with some rhythm that was not quite human. Catherine wept quietly until dawn. She knew what her husband would call it: a mark of impurity, proof of corruption. But to her, it looked like survival. The next day, the nurse vanished. Her bed untouched, her apron folded neatly on the chair. The colonel said nothing, only locked the nursery and forbade Catherine from entering. But at night, she still heard the hum. It traveled through the walls, through her bones. It spoke in rhythm with her heartbeat. And when she pressed her palm to the boards, she could swear something warm pulsed back. The air in Magnolia House thickened as July approached. The walls seemed to perspire, candles guttered for lack of oxygen. Everything that breathed did so laboriously, as though some invisible pressure had descended from the ceiling and settled on their chests. Catherine Harlow no longer marked the days by sunrise or supper, but by the sound the house made. Mornings came with a slow creak in the beams, evenings with the faint hum rising from beneath the nursery. Sometimes she would place her hand on the floorboards and whisper to it, "I hear you," as if acknowledging the pulse might keep it at bay. The colonel avoided her now except during meals. He ate little and spoke less, except to ask for updates on the infants. His voice carefully stripped of emotion, like a man discussing the condition of a crop. He recorded their feeding times, their weights, their cries, in a small black notebook that never left his pocket. Catherine suspected he was corresponding with someone, perhaps a physician or a colleague from Charleston, but no letters came or went by post. Instead, a rider arrived one night just before a storm, his face hidden by a broad hat. He carried a sealed parcel addressed in an unfamiliar hand. Catherine was forbidden from opening it, but she saw the label as the colonel took it. Dr. E. H. Lawton, Society for Comparative Physiology, Philadelphia. He took the parcel into his study, locked the door, and did not emerge for hours. When he did, his hands were stained with ink and something darker, something that left faint smears on the doorknob. That night, he entered the nursery again, this time carrying a lamp and a leather case. Catherine followed quietly to the threshold, heart pounding. He was bent over the cradle, whispering to himself, the lamplight trembling in his hand. She saw him touch the darker child's wrist, press his thumb against the faint glowing veins, and then write something in his notebook. "Why are you doing this?" she asked from the doorway. He turned, startled, then straightened. "Observation," he said. "It is the only way to understand what has occurred." "They are babies," she said. "Not specimens." He smiled without warmth. "When the laws of nature are broken, Catherine, it becomes necessary to document the debris." He left the nursery then, the lamp's glow retreating down the hall like a wound closing. That was when she began keeping her own notes. Not in the bound journal her husband might find, but in scraps of paper hidden behind the molding, beneath the loose boards near the hearth. July 3, he measures them in secret. The white one flinches when he touches him, the dark one does not. He calls them Case A and Case B. I heard him say he will write to the society again once he confirms the pattern. July 5, the hum has changed. It sounds like breathing now, but deeper, as if through a hollow chest. The darker child wakes when it begins, eyes open, looking toward the floor. Sometimes he smiles. The pale one screams. That evening, a servant boy came running from the stables, saying the hound had found something by the riverbank. A small bundle of cloth caught among the reeds. When they brought it back, Catherine saw it was the nurse's apron, stiff with dried mud and something darker. The colonel ordered it burned without ceremony. Later, when he thought himself alone, Catherine heard him vomiting in the washroom. She almost pitied him. Almost. A week later, the man from Philadelphia arrived. He was younger than Catherine expected, scarcely 30, clean-shaven and pale, with spectacles that glinted like two cold coins. His name, as he introduced himself, was Dr. Edwin Lawton. Though his manner suggested he preferred to be called simply Doctor, he brought with him a heavy trunk and a box of instruments that looked nothing like those used for medicine: metal rods, glass tubes, and what appeared to be lengths of fine wire wound into coils. He examined the twins without speaking for nearly an hour, then took the colonel aside. Catherine could not hear what was said, but the colonel's expression grew more intent with each passing minute. That night, they dined together in the study. Catherine was not invited. She stood in the hallway, listening to the low murmur of their voices. Words drifted through the door: hybridization, atavism, electrical impulse. When Dr. Lawton finally retired to the guest room, Catherine intercepted him at the landing. "What are you doing to my children?" she demanded. He paused, startled, but recovered quickly. "Madam, your husband has requested that I conduct certain observations, purely empirical. You have nothing to fear." "I fear plenty," she said. "They are infants. You speak of them as if they were curiosities." He regarded her for a long moment, and in that look she saw something, pity perhaps, or fascination. "There are forces in nature," he said softly, "that do not obey the rules we pretend to understand. When such a phenomenon appears, one must choose either to destroy it, or to study it. And which have you chosen?" He smiled faintly. That depends on what I find. The next morning, she woke to the sound of hammering from the nursery. The colonel and the doctor had sealed the windows with boards. They claimed it was to control the temperature for observation. No one was allowed inside. Not even Catherine. From behind the door came the cries of the infants, sometimes one, sometimes both, sometimes overlapping so perfectly that they sounded like a single voice split in two. She could no longer sleep. The hum had grown constant, no longer rising and falling with the hours. It thrummed in her bones, in the teeth of her comb, in the iron of the bed frame. When she pressed her ear to the floor, she heard whispers in rhythm with her heartbeat underneath, underneath. July 12, I think it comes from below the old cistern. There is a door there, sealed long ago. The servants say the colonel's father kept something there during the fever years. I mean to find it. July 13, the darker child's glow has spread. When I touched his hand, a warmth passed into me like current. My fingers trembled for hours. July 14, the doctor leaves at night. I saw him by the river, lowering something heavy into the water. When he returned, he washed his hands for a long time. The house was a maze of sounds now. Hammering, humming, distant weeping. Catherine's thoughts began to fragment. Sometimes she saw Solomon's face, in the dark glass of the windows, reflected behind her shoulder. Other times she swore she heard the twins, whispering to one another in their cradle, though their mouths did not move. The colonel no longer looked at her directly. His eyes had taken on a feverish brightness, a gleam of purpose that frightened her more than anger ever could. He spoke of purity, of the necessity of documentation, of building a record for the ages. When she tried to remind him that they were his sons, he corrected her. One is mine. The other belongs to history. That night, Catherine dreamt she was walking through the flooded cellar of the house. The walls pulsed like living tissue. Beneath the water floated pages from her husband's ledger, each name dissolving into ink. She reached out to grasp one, but it disintegrated under her fingers, leaving only a single word written in red: inheritance. She awoke to a strange stillness. The hum had stopped. At dawn, she went to the nursery door. The boards sealing the windows had been removed. Inside, the cradles were empty. Down the hall, the colonel's study stood open. On the desk lay the doctor's trunk, half packed, its instruments gleaming faintly in the dim light. There were stains on the carpet, dark and circular, leading toward the rear corridor that descended to the old storage cellar. Catherine followed them. The air grew colder as she descended, the smell of damp stone and metal thickening around her. At the bottom of the stairs, she found the door the servants had spoken of. The one beneath the cistern. It was open. She could not see inside at first, only the shimmer of lamplight reflecting off water. Then she heard it again. The hum, faint but distinct, coming from below the surface. And above it, barely audible, the sound of a child's breath. They found the nurse's body at first light, or what was left of her. The house staff had gathered at the edge of the orchard, whispering in a language Catherine did not understand, crossing themselves, muttering prayers half remembered from older countries. Someone fetched Colonel Ashcroft, who came out still half-dressed, pistol in hand. The corpse was discovered just beyond the smokehouse, where the fog gathered thickest at dawn, tangled in the roots of an old water oak. Her eyes were open. Her mouth, too. But it wasn't the stillness of ordinary death that frightened them. It was the absence. Her face was slack in a way that seemed emptied, as though something had been drawn out of her. The doctor called it post-mortem compression, but the servants knew better. There were 2 punctures on the side of her throat, small but precise, no animal tearing, no human tool. When the colonel knelt to inspect, Catherine had to look away. He rose, wiping his hands on his coat. "We will not discuss this beyond the house," he said flatly. "You will say she took ill in the night and passed." No one contradicted him. They never did. But Catherine noticed how Dinah, The housemaid assigned to the nursery wouldn't look at the colonel as he spoke. Later, when Catherine returned upstairs, she found Dinah kneeling outside the nursery door, head bowed low, whispering something under her breath. Catherine listened a prayer, though not a Christian one. "Dinah," she said quietly. "What is it?" The maid flinched. "Mom, it's best not to say. The baby, he ain't right." "Not right?" Dinah shook her head. "The pale one sleeps normal. The other one, he don't close his eyes proper. He watches the ceiling like he sees things up there. When I pick him up, my arms go cold. He don't cry like a baby neither. He hums." Catherine stared at her. "Hums, yes, ma'am. Like," she paused, searching for words, "like something big breathing under the floorboards." Catherine told herself this was foolishness. Dinah was frightened, half out of her mind after the nurse's death. Yet when Catherine went into the nursery, the air did feel colder. The twins were lying side by side, wrapped in identical white cloths. The lighter child stirred when she approached, a soft whimper escaping his lips. The darker one, Samuel, was awake, eyes open, staring not at her but at the ceiling beams. His gaze was steady, unblinking, and faintly, she heard it a vibration more than a sound, rising and falling like a breath drawn through hollow wood. She picked him up. The hum stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse. That night, the colonel ordered that the nursery door remain locked when unattended. He blamed the nurse's death on outside intruders, though none of the dogs had barked and the grounds showed no tracks. The household moved like sleepwalkers through the next days, waiting for some explanation that never came. The doctor arrived from the parish, carrying with him the odor of alcohol and carbolic acid. He examined the children, declaring them healthy. But when Catherine pressed him, asked whether one child could influence the other in the womb, whether blood or humors could cross between twin vessels, he only frowned. "In rare instances," he said, "certain anomalies occur. Twins share not merely a mother's nourishment but her essence. A defect in one may echo in the other. But what you describe, madam," he hesitated, "that is not science." "Then what is it?" He did not answer. By the third night, even the colonel seemed unsettled. He had taken to sleeping in his study, his rifle within reach. Catherine heard him pacing long after midnight, muttering accounts under his breath, as though reciting the plantation's ledgers could impose order upon the chaos, creeping in at the edges. It was nearly 2 in the morning when the first cry sounded from the nursery. High, sharp, cutting through the hush of the hall, like metal on glass. Catherine rushed toward the sound before she even realized she was moving. The locked door stood open. Inside, the air stank of iron and milk gone sour. One of the cradles was overturned. Dinah was crouched in the corner, whispering, "Lord save us," over and over. Catherine's eyes went to the bed. The pale twin lay there red-faced and wailing. Beside him, Samuel was perfectly still, watching his brother's face with that same eerie calm. The hum had returned, louder now, coming from the walls, the floor, the cradle boards. Catherine felt it in her chest, resonating with her heartbeat, until she couldn't tell which was which. "What happened?" she demanded. Dinah only shook her head. "He touched the other, ma'am. Just reached out and touched him, and the little one started screaming. I tried to pull them apart but—" She broke off, pressing her shaking hands to her mouth. "His skin burned my fingers." Catherine knelt, pried the twins apart. There was a faint mark on the lighter child's wrist, like the impression of tiny fingers, already purpling. Samuel's eyes tracked her every motion. When she met his gaze, she felt dizzy, as though something vast and silent had noticed her from within him. She wrapped both boys and took them to her own chamber. All night she sat by the hearth, one child at each breast praying, though she didn't know to whom. At dawn, she went to find her husband. The colonel was at his desk, writing something in his ledger with slow, deliberate strokes. "You've locked me in that house," she said. "You've locked us all in." He didn't look up. "Security, Catherine, until this business with the slave uprising settles. We can't have rumors spreading about our family." "Then explain the nurse. Explain the marks." He set his pen down. "Superstitions. You've been listening to them. I saw it." Now he looked at her, eyes pale as glass. "You saw what you wanted to see. You've always had a delicate constitution." Her hands trembled. "You think I'm mad?" "I think," he said quietly, "that grief and confinement are not kind to a woman's mind. I'll send for Dr. Merrow again. He can prescribe a tonic." Catherine turned and left before he could finish. Down the corridor, she heard the hum again. That evening, a storm broke over the plantation. Wind hammered the windows, rain slashed across the veranda. Catherine sat awake, unable to sleep, the twins beside her in their cradle. Lightning flickered across the walls like the pages of a burning book. At some point, exhaustion took her. She woke to silence. Thick, total, unnatural. The fire had gone out. The room was black. She groped for the candle, struck a match. The cradle was empty. For a long moment, she couldn't breathe. Then she saw the door open a crack. She snatched the candle and stepped into the hall. The wind had died. The air hung heavy with that same iron scent. Downstairs, a single light burned in the study. She followed it. The colonel sat there, motionless, one hand resting on the open ledger. On his desk lay both twins. The lighter child slept, chest rising and falling shallowly. The darker one, Samuel, was awake, watching his father. Between them, something glistened, a line of blood running from one infant's wrist to the other's. Catherine cried out. The colonel looked up, eyes hollow, voice low. "I tried to separate them," he said. "He wouldn't let go. Put him down. They're linked, Catherine, like veins in the same body. I can't." He broke off, staring at the children as if seeing them for the first time. One feeds the other. Thunder cracked overhead. The candlelight flickered. For an instant, Catherine thought she saw movement in the shadows behind her husband. Something that leaned close, whispering through his breath. Then the flame went out. When the servants entered at sunrise, they found the study empty. The cradle stood overturned beside the desk. The colonel's ledger lay open to a page half, scorched by the candle's fall. On it, written in his precise, slanted hand, were the words, "The Dark One breathes for them both." The twins were gone. August 1847, the house breathes, even when the fires are gone. You can hear it through the floorboards. A pulse that isn't wind, a rhythm that belongs to no living man. When the ashes had cooled enough to walk upon, Dr. Ellery returned from Jackson with a cart of new medical instruments. Gleaming brass and polished glass, each packed in straw as though they were relics. He found Catherine confined to the south room, her wrist still bound, where the nurse had tied her during the fits. The colonel had ordered isolation, for the safety of the children, though neither child could be found. The official reason for their absence was that they were being kept under medical observation. Ellery noted in his record that both infants displayed abnormal coloration inconsistent with shared parentage. A line that would later be scratched out in another hand, as if the paper itself flinched from what it recorded. The colonel avoided Catherine for 2 days after the cellar incident. When he finally appeared, his face was drawn, almost bloodless, but his voice had returned to its familiar precision. "You'll see the physician today," he said. "He will confirm what I already know." For Catherine asked what that was. "That this affliction is not spiritual," he said. "It's hereditary, contamination in the bloodline. We will excise it, and all will be set right." She didn't answer. Her body had grown so light from loss that even sitting upright was labor. But the way he said excise filled her with a dread worse than the flames. Ellery's examination was clinical, detached. He wrote that the mother exhibits signs of nervous fever and postnatal delusion. But his attention lingered not on Catherine, but on what had been taken from the nursery. 2 glass jars sat on the desk beside the bassinet, sealed with wax. In one, formalin floated around, what looked like umbilical tissue. In the other, something less identifiable, fibrous, the color of ivory. The doctor asked, softly, if these had belonged to the infants. The Colonel replied that they were evidence, and refused further elaboration. Ellery's pen scratched rapidly for several lines, then stopped. The rest of the page was left blank, as if silence could hold what words could not. By the 3rd week of August, the remaining servants began to vanish. Some left footprints leading into the cypress swamp and never returned. Others were dismissed outright with no pay. Only 2 remained in the main house, a mute woman named Lisa and a boy who tended the boiler. Both slept in the corridor outside Catherine's door. Instructed to report if she spoke of the children again, she did not. Instead, she listened. The sound had returned, faint, rhythmic, beneath the boards. It came at night when the candles burned low, when even the insects hushed. It was not quite a heartbeat. It was 2, slightly out of time with each other, as though one beat inside the other's echo. She tried to ignore it, until she saw the first stain spread through the floor. A patch of dark moisture, irregular but steady. When she touched it, her finger came away warm. The doctor said the house was still drying from the rain, though there had been none for days. In the records preserved by the Stratford Historical Society, collected in 1911 from the ruins of the estate, there exists a ledger labeled Medical Observations, August 1831-1847. Its contents are uneven, half formal notes, half near biblical mutterings. The handwriting alternates between Ellery's neat copperplate and the Colonel's harsher scroll. A few excerpts survive. August 19, the specimens preserved. The lighter one ceased respiration at dawn, yet the darker child's chest expanded at the same moment. It is as though one life transfers through some unseen vessel. August 21 experiment repeated in miniature with rodents. No reproducible results. Hypothesis remains the twins share one vital essence. When one weakens, the other strengthens. August 23 Catherine refuses sustenance. Claims she dreams of Solomon calling from beneath the floor. Unclear whether delusion or shared hallucination among the servants. August 25 the sound persists. Rhythmic, low, pulsing from beneath the boards in the east corridor. Cannot locate the source. Most of these pages are later smeared with what appears to be soot or blood. The final entry in the Colonel's hand reads, August 28, it is not disease but division. They were meant to be one body, split by sin and recombined by fire. I can still hear them calling for each other. The hum is the sound of their reunion. Catherine's journal from the same period, discovered in a false compartment of her writing desk, offers a mirror image of those notes. Where his words are scientific, hers are confessional, filled with dread and resignation. One passage, written in pencil so faint it nearly disappears, reads, he wants to open them, to prove his theory that they share a single heart. I told him the heart was never his to begin with. He said he will cut the truth from their bodies if he must. On the night of August 29th, the nurse's bell began ringing though the cord had long been severed. Lisa, the mute servant, was the first to notice it, trembling as she pointed toward the nursery door. Behind it, a dull knocking echoed, slow and deliberate, childlike in rhythm, impossibly patient. The Colonel ordered the door bolted and posted himself outside it with a pistol and Bible. No one slept. By morning, the sound had stopped. But when Ellery entered to check the jars, one was found shattered. The preserved tissue was gone. Later that same day, Catherine escaped her confinement for the first time. Lisa had left the key on the desk, perhaps by accident, perhaps not. Catherine made her way down the east corridor barefoot, following the faint warmth that seeped up from beneath the floor. The air grew heavier with every step. In the study, she found the Colonel kneeling beside a circle of chalk drawn on the boards, the missing ledger open before him. On it lay the remaining infant, wrapped in muslin, alive, or something close to alive. Its chest rose and fell irregularly, as if it borrowed breath from the room itself. He didn't notice her until she spoke. "Where is his brother?" He looked up, eyes hollow, voice distant. "Inside him." Then he placed the scalpel against the child's chest. Catherine moved without thought. The next pages of her journal are splattered and unreadable, but one line survives at the bottom of the entry: "I had to take the heart from his hand before he took it from my son." What followed remains contested. The colonel's body was never formally buried. Only fragments of uniform buttons and bone were recovered from the ash pit behind the stables. Dr. Ellery's testimony, recorded in 1848 during the inquest, was strangely evasive. He claimed Catherine succumbed to delusion and violence, but provided no details of the final confrontation. The sanitarium records from Charleston later describe her as lucid, articulate, but unwilling to discuss the events of August. One detail unites every account. After that night, the hum in the floors ceased. A final document appended to Ellery's journal appears to have been written weeks later, perhaps during his own breakdown. It reads like a confession addressed to no one. The anatomical impossibility of dual respiration was refuted, yet I heard it myself. One cry divided into two bodies. I examined the surviving child before departing. No physical abnormality, save a faint second pulse detectable near the clavicle, as though two rhythms attempted coexistence within one frame. I recommended immediate baptism. The colonel refused, saying the child was already consecrated by fire. The remainder of the page is burned, but at the bottom margin, faintly visible, is a single phrase repeated 3 times. "They share a heart." The smoke had barely cleared from Magnolia Creek when whispers began to form in the nearby settlements, a low murmur of astonishment, fear, and incredulity. The story, as it spread, was filtered through fear, myth, and necessities. A white woman had survived the fire. A husband had perished attempting to save property rather than life. And the enslaved had taken advantage of chaos to vanish like shadows into the night. No one mentioned the twins, and no one speculated about the darker implications of the colonel's bloodline. Those details were too dangerous, too threatening to the fragile balance of their world. Catherine found herself in Charleston, bruised, exhausted, and painfully aware of the weight she carried. Not only the child in her arms, but also the secret that she could never voice without risking the ruin of everyone involved. The child she held, pale, skinned, quiet, and fragile, was James, the colonel's heir. She had given Thomas to Solomon, trusting that a man who had already defied the system could protect him. Even as she settled into the quiet anonymity of her temporary refuge, Catherine knew that the choice she had made, the impossible division of her sons, would haunt her as long as she lived. The small boarding house where she stayed functioned under strict discretion. It was a sanctuary in every sense: no prying eyes, no questions about past names or past lives, only careful support for women who had survived situations society would not forgive. For Catherine, it was both relief and punishment. The quiet hours allowed her to nurse her baby, patch her wounds, and reconstruct her shattered body, but the solitude forced her to confront the enormity of her decisions, to examine each flickering memory of the night Magnolia Creek burned. The colonel's last words, cold and precise, reverberated in her mind. "I will spend the rest of my life hunting you. You will never be free of me." She had survived him that night, yes, but what of the man she had given her son to? Solomon had been a figure of both fascination and terror, measured, intelligent, unyielding, and yet capable of profound compassion. His planning had allowed nearly 50 enslaved people to escape in the chaos. That he had also promised to raise Thomas in freedom gave Catherine a sliver of solace, but it was one constantly tested by the unknown. Every day without news was a day filled with gnawing worry. Did Thomas survive? Was he truly safe? Had Solomon's promise endured the perils of travel and secrecy? In the days following her arrival in Charleston, Catherine made cautious inquiries, leveraging her family's connections. Her brother Thomas, ever the pragmatic ally, ensured that her stay at the boarding house was secure and discreet. The letter she had managed to hide, retrieved from the ruins of Magnolia Creek by a loyal house slave, had become her lifeline to understanding her choices. It detailed, in painstaking clarity, what she had witnessed and what she had been forced to do. To anyone else, it might have read as a confession of moral failure. To her, it was a guide, a manual for navigating survival in a world that offered few guarantees. The colony of enslaved escapees, scattered in the aftermath of the fire, had begun to coalesce in pockets of safety. Many fled northward along the secret routes of the Underground Railroad, moving under cover of night, relying on coded signals and the assistance of sympathetic allies. It was a dangerous path, and not all would make it, but Catherine held on to the hope that Thomas had found his way. She imagined Solomon, tall and commanding, moving through towns with quiet purpose, the child in his arms, evading the eyes that sought to claim them both. Yet as days stretched into weeks, the toll of childbirth, trauma, and secrecy left Catherine in a fragile state. Nights were the worst. She would wake screaming, haunted by visions of flames, the colonel's enraged face, and the two infants, the children she could not protect together. Even in the boarding house, there were limits to safety, and Catherine knew that the world she had entered as a survivor demanded vigilance at every turn. Months later, she began to understand the extent of her isolation. Charleston was a city of appearances, and in the wake of Magnolia Creek, she was a ghost within it, moving silently, speaking only when necessary, keeping James close. She provided him with love, education, and security, yet the shadows of his origins lurked behind her eyes. She told him only partial truths, fabrications designed to preserve his innocence and protect him from the horrors of his father's cruelty, the rebellion, and the fire that had claimed so many lives. In truth, Catherine carried both the burden of knowledge and the burden of impossibility. She had saved one son at the expense of the other, and the memory of that choice shaped every moment of her motherhood. Time, slow and unyielding, became a merciless companion. Years passed, and Catherine watched James grow into a healthy, intelligent child, bright and inquisitive. She marveled at his resilience, his curiosity, and the quiet strength she recognized in him. Traits she hoped were inherited from his father, traits tempered by the circumstances of their survival. She could not speak his history aloud. The truth was too dangerous, too destabilizing. And yet she kept writing, documenting her choices, her regrets, and her fears in journals hidden beneath loose floorboards. Journals she hoped might one day reach Thomas, or someone who could piece together the fragmented story. Meanwhile, across state lines, whispers of Solomon's survival began to circulate. Though details remained obscured by secrecy and necessity, the man who had orchestrated so much chaos and chance became a phantom in records, a name changed slightly, a child in his care, journeys northward hinted at, but never confirmed. In the Underground Railroad's coded communications, tales of a tall, intelligent black man, moving steadily through towns with a child in his arms circulated quietly, untraceable to the authorities who might seek to recapture him. For those who had escaped the horrors of plantations like Magnolia Creek, Solomon represented both hope and defiance. A man who had risked everything to save others, and who had succeeded in ways that official records would never acknowledge. As Catherine aged, she came to understand the strange duality of her life. In public, she was a quiet widow, a mother protecting her child from exposure and judgment. In private, she was a witness and chronicler of rebellion, cruelty, and survival. A keeper of truths too dangerous to share. Her journals became repositories of memory, painstaking accounts of choices made in extremity, descriptions of human resilience and moral ambiguity. Every sentence was a confession, every paragraph a justification, and yet also a warning that the structures of power that had dictated so much of her life could, and often did, fail spectacularly when challenged by necessity and courage. James grew, unaware of the complexities that had shaped his survival. He was raised to respect authority, to value education, and to understand justice as his mother defined it. Catherine carefully curated his experiences, ensuring he was shielded from the cruelties and inequities that had dominated the lives of both his father and the enslaved at Magnolia Creek. He flourished in ways she could scarcely have imagined in those initial days after the fire, a testament to resilience in the face of catastrophe. And yet, even in the quiet domesticity of Charleston, the legacy of that night persisted. The fire at Magnolia Creek, the death of Colonel Bowmont, the escape of the enslaved, and the separation of the twins lingered like smoke in Catherine's mind. She knew that history, as written by the powerful, would erase the nuances, the moral complexities, and the acts of bravery and desperation that had defined the events. But in her private journals, she preserved them, truths that might one day illuminate the lives of those who survived, and offer some measure of recognition for those who could not. Solomon's fate, like that of Thomas, remained a question without a definitive answer. Catherine imagined the two of them, father and son, navigating the hidden paths northward, disappearing into communities that could protect them, teaching, building, surviving. Every imagined reunion, every potential correspondence, was a reminder that choices, even impossible ones, could ripple across time, creating paths toward freedom and dignity that official records would never capture. Even as she aged, Catherine remained vigilant, aware that the world she had left behind in Mississippi might continue to encroach upon the fragile sanctuary she had built. Her letters, her journals, and her memories became instruments of preservation, a private archive of lives touched by fire, oppression, love, and desperation. She wrote not for recognition, not for absolution, but to ensure that the truths she had witnessed, and the choices she had made, would survive in some form, an unbroken testimony of human resilience against the cruelty of circumstance. As Charleston grew and time passed, Catherine continued her careful routine, tending to James, documenting her thoughts, and reflecting upon the moral labyrinth in which she had been forced to operate. She understood that survival demanded compromises and courage in equal measure, and she recognized the enduring power of secrecy as both a shield and a weapon. The fire that had destroyed Magnolia Creek had not only claimed lives, it had revealed human strength, the limits of control, and the moral choices that define generations. Catherine's final years were spent in quiet contemplation. She never spoke of Thomas openly, never revealed Solomon's name or the details of the rebellion, but in her journals, the story lived on, an unbroken record of decisions, survival, and the enduring impact of a single, violent night in Mississippi. When she passed away, she left behind a legacy of discretion, of courage, and of a mother's impossible choice. A choice that had ensured the survival of one son, had entrusted another to the care of a man who defied both law and convention, and had preserved, in secret, a story too volatile to tell aloud. The fire at Magnolia Creek, the rebellion, and the twins' separation became myth in the wider world, obscured by convenience and the desire to maintain order. But in the quiet archives of Catherine's home, in the journals she kept hidden, the full story endured, a testament to courage, moral complexity, and the hidden histories that define human lives. It is a story of survival, of impossible choices, and of the ways in which individuals navigate the fragile line between morality, necessity, and the raw instinct to protect those they love. Years passed, and James Bowmont grew into a young man under the careful watch of his mother and the quiet guardianship of Charleston society. He was intelligent, capable, and curious, yet Catherine had shielded him from the darker truths of his birth. Stories of Magnolia Creek were told only as tragedy. The fire, the loss of life, the heroism of his father, Colonel Bowmont, who had perished trying to save others. There was no mention of his twin brother, no acknowledgement that his survival had come at the cost of another life in secrecy. Catherine watched him with a mixture of pride and anxiety. James thrived, excelling in reading, rhetoric, and law, but every milestone reminded her of the choice she had made. The child she had surrendered to Solomon's care, the path of freedom and danger that she could neither verify nor control. In her quiet moments, she would imagine Thomas, wondering if the boy had survived, if he had found freedom, if he had grown strong and capable under the guidance of the man she had entrusted him to. Meanwhile, in Canada, Thomas Turner, born Thomas Bowmont in the chaos of the fire, was growing up under the careful eye of Solomon. The man who had orchestrated the escape had fulfilled his promise with precision and patience. He taught Thomas carpentry, literacy, and the value of knowledge as power. He instilled in the boy an understanding of freedom as something hard, one fragile, and worth protecting. Unlike James, Thomas had grown up knowing the risks of a world determined to claim him, a world in which his very existence could be considered a threat. Thomas's life in Chatham, Ontario, was shaped by community and resilience. Fugitive slaves, free black families, and sympathetic neighbors formed a support network, a hidden society built on vigilance, cooperation, and the quiet exercise of autonomy. Solomon guided Thomas through these social networks, teaching him survival strategy and the importance of observation. By the time Thomas reached adolescence, he understood not only the physical skills required to survive, but also the subtle politics and dangers of navigating a society that might accept him legally, but remained hostile in sentiment. Back in Charleston, Catherine continued to monitor James's growth, ensuring that he received an education and upbringing that would allow him to thrive within a world still structured by class and race. She cultivated connections, ensured access to tutors, and carefully managed every potential threat to his security. James, innocent of the true history that surrounded his birth, came to see the world as a place of opportunity, largely sheltered from the brutal realities that had defined his mother's earlier life. Despite their distance, the lives of James and Thomas were tethered together by blood, by circumstance, and by the secret decisions of a mother forced to navigate a world built on cruelty and oppression. Catherine's journals, hidden in her Charleston home, became an unintentional bridge between the brothers. She documented her fears, her hopes, and her regrets, creating a record that, decades later, might allow Thomas and James to understand one another, or at least understand the impossible choices that had shaped their existence. As Thomas matured, he took Solomon's lessons to heart. The boy grew into a capable, intelligent young man who understood the fragility of freedom and the power of knowledge. He apprenticed as a carpenter, learned the intricacies of local governance, and slowly began to build connections that would allow him to establish a life independent of the fugitive networks. Yet, in the quiet moments of reflection, Thomas felt a gnawing absence, a sense that part of his history remained concealed from him. He knew he had been rescued, nurtured, and protected, but he did not know the identity of the woman who had given him to Solomon, or the child who had been left behind. James, now a young adult in Charleston, began his legal career with ambition and drive. He understood justice as a concept shaped by rules and precedents, but his mother had ensured he carried with him a moral compass rooted in empathy. He occasionally pondered the stories of Magnolia Creek, but they remained abstract, disconnected from the life he had come to know. The fire, the chaos, the enslaved who had disappeared, all were stories in newspapers and family lore, detached from the personal stakes that had defined them decades earlier. One day, an unexpected letter arrived for Catherine, addressed simply in a handwriting she did not immediately recognize. The envelope was unmarked by postal stamps or city addresses, a method of discreet delivery she understood well. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded with care, containing a few words that would unsettle the fragile equilibrium she had maintained for decades. I am alive. I am free. I do not know my mother or my brother, but I know the night of fire and survival. I seek the truth. Catherine's hands trembled as she held the note. The years of secrecy, the careful maintenance of safety and discretion, all converged in this moment. She had lived with the fear that Thomas might not survive, the knowledge that she had chosen to separate her children, the constant anxiety over Solomon's promise. And now, decades later, a single letter suggested that her faith in Solomon's judgment had been justified. Thomas had survived. For Catherine, the arrival of the letter was both relief and terror. The relief came from knowing that Thomas had lived, that the child she had surrendered to the care of a man she trusted had not only survived but thrived. The terror came from the recognition that her carefully constructed life of secrecy could unravel, that James, and the rest of her life in Charleston, might be touched by the truth she had worked so hard to conceal. She sat with the letter for hours, rereading the words, reconstructing the possibilities. How had Thomas found a way to send this note? Had he traveled south? Did he know of James? Did he understand the complexity of the choices she had made? The questions multiplied, each more urgent than the last. Yet Catherine also recognized the inevitability of confrontation with history. Time and circumstance would eventually demand reckoning, whether she was ready or not. In Chatham, Thomas Turner had grown into a figure of quiet influence. He was respected in his community, valued for his intelligence, his moral integrity, and his ability to navigate the delicate complexities of freedom in a hostile world. The arrival of the letter marked the beginning of a new chapter, a tentative step toward uncovering the fragmented history of his birth. The woman who had given him to Solomon, and the brother whose existence he had never known. Catherine knew that the truth, when revealed, would carry consequences. She also understood that it could bring reconciliation, understanding, or renewed pain. But as she prepared to respond, or perhaps simply to observe, she realized that the legacy of Magnolia Creek was not limited to fire, destruction, or cruelty. It was also a legacy of survival, resilience, and the enduring hope that even the most impossible choices could, in some way, preserve life. For the first time in decades, Catherine allowed herself to hope that Thomas might not only survive but thrive, that he might one day understand the decisions made for his survival, and perhaps that he might one day meet his twin, James, two brothers, separated by circumstance and necessity, yet connected by blood, resilience, and the enduring consequences of one fateful night in Mississippi. The shadows of the past lingered, as they always would, but for Catherine, there was a fragile, tentative peace in knowing that her choices had given both sons a chance at life. Even if it was divided, even if it was incomplete, and even if the full truth would remain shrouded in secrecy for a time yet. Years passed, and Thomas Turner's curiosity about his origins grew as he matured. Solomon had always been cautious, teaching Thomas about survival, freedom, and discretion, but he had never given the boy full details of the night of his birth. He emphasized the importance of understanding one's environment, building skills, and valuing knowledge, yet the shadows of mystery remained in Thomas's life like an unfinished story. By the late 1860s, Thomas had established himself as a respected teacher and community organizer in Chatham, Ontario. He advocated for the rights of Black Canadians, helped recently freed or escaped slaves settle, and taught carpentry and literacy to those in need. though he was deeply connected to his community. A quiet ache persisted, a sense that his life had begun elsewhere, a life connected to someone he would never meet unless fate intervened. In Charleston, James Bowmont had become a prominent attorney. Catherine had guided him carefully, ensuring that he grew up with both privilege and compassion. He frequently assisted freed slaves, navigating the legal system after the Civil War, helping them secure land, education, and legal rights. But the specter of Magnolia Creek haunted Catherine, and through her, James carried a faint echo of fear and uncertainty that he could not fully articulate. Then one day, a letter arrived for James, delivered discreetly, bearing the seal of someone who had once been enslaved. "I do not know you, but I believe we share a past. I am Thomas Turner. Your existence and mine are entwined by choices made long ago. I seek connection. If you are willing, meet me at the old ferry crossing near the Savannah River on the 3rd of June. Catherine's hands shook as she read the words aloud to James. The boy she had raised, now a man, gazed at her in stunned silence. The name Thomas had long been a ghost in her mind, a memory of the child she had given away in desperation. But now it demanded recognition, demanded action. "Mother, could this be?" James began. "Yes," Catherine said softly. "It's him. It has to be him." Solomon kept his promise. He survived. The next few weeks were filled with tense preparation. Catherine debated whether James should go alone or if she should accompany him. Ultimately, she decided it was James's journey, a chance for him to meet the brother he had never known, to confront a truth long buried. She armed him with knowledge of the fire, the plantation, and the circumstances of their birth, careful to frame it as both a survival story and a lesson in the consequences of decisions made under duress. On the morning of June 3rd, James approached the old ferry crossing. The air was thick with humidity, the river flowing quietly beneath the wooden planks. He scanned the tree line across the water, anxious yet determined. The sound of footsteps made him turn, and there, stepping from the shadows, was Thomas. The two men stared at each other. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable. The same eyes, the same strong jawline, the same aura of intelligence and determination. Thomas extended a hand, but James hesitated, uncertain whether to embrace him, to step forward, or simply remain frozen by the enormity of the moment. "You're James," Thomas said finally, his voice calm but layered with emotion. "Yes. And you're Thomas?" James replied, his voice cracked slightly, betraying his nerves. Thomas nodded. "I never knew my mother, never knew my family beyond Solomon. But I know the night of fire, the chaos, and the choices that allowed me to live. I want to know the rest. I want to know you if you'll let me." James stepped forward, and in that moment, the two men embraced, not as strangers, but as brothers, connected by blood and by the decisions that had defined their lives. It was a quiet, trembling reconciliation, filled with gratitude, sorrow, and unspoken questions. As they pulled back, James gestured toward the river. "Come, let's sit. Let me tell you about Charleston, about our mother, about the world we were born into and how we survived it." While hours passed as stories unfolded, James spoke of Catherine's care, the life he had led under her protection, and the lessons he had learned navigating a society still grappling with the aftermath of slavery and war. Thomas shared his life with Solomon, his escape, and the community he had built in freedom. The conversation was honest, painful, and healing all at once. They laughed at the coincidences, mourned the losses, and acknowledged the deep injustice of the society that had forced them into separation. Both men understood that while their paths had diverged dramatically, they were now bound together by choice, by recognition, and by a shared desire to honor their mother's sacrifice and Solomon's bravery. Before parting that evening, Thomas handed James a small, leather-bound journal. "Solomon kept a record of everything," he said. "I don't know how much Catherine knew, but this is the truth of that night, the rebellion, and the escape. I want you to have it, to understand the world that shaped us. The James took the journal carefully, recognizing the weight it carried. Not just facts, but the moral and human complexities of their shared history. "Thank you," he said softly. "I will honor it. I will honor them." In the weeks that followed, the brothers began the slow work of reconnecting. Letters, visits, and shared memories built a fragile but unbreakable bond. They spoke of Catherine, of Solomon, and of the lives that had been touched by their survival. Though the scars of separation could not be erased, the connection they had long been denied provided a sense of closure, understanding, and, above all, the hope that the past, no matter how dark, could guide them toward a future where their existence mattered beyond the constraints of history. Catherine watched from Charleston, her heart both heavy and full. She had made an impossible choice, one that had haunted her for decades, but now she could see the fruits of that choice. Not destruction, not loss, but life, resilience, and the enduring bonds of family forged in fire and secrecy. The story of Magnolia Creek, once a tale of fire, rebellion, and cruelty, had transformed. Through the courage of a mother, the cunning of a man determined to free others, and the survival of two boys, born into impossible circumstances, the story had become one of endurance, justice, and the unbreakable ties of blood. Even as the world around them continued to change, the memory of that August night, the fire that had consumed a plantation, and the choices made in desperation, remained etched in their lives. A reminder that human courage, ingenuity, and love could persist, even in the darkest corners of history. And so, Thomas and James, once separated by fate and circumstance, now moved forward together, not just as brothers, but as living testimony to the power of survival, the complexity of moral choice, and the enduring legacy of those who dared to defy a system designed to destroy them. The years after their reunion were both a blessing and a burden for Thomas and James. Though they had finally found each other, the scars of separation ran deep, and the shadow of Magnolia Creek lingered over them. Yet, both men carried a quiet determination to honor the lives lost, the people freed, and the courage that had allowed them to survive. Thomas had settled fully in Chatham, Ontario, now running a modest school and carpentry shop. His reputation as a teacher of literacy and practical skills spread among the black communities, attracting children and young adults seeking knowledge and self-sufficiency. He always taught discretion first, never to reveal their pasts carelessly, but he wove lessons of resilience, integrity, and self-respect into every curriculum. James, on the other hand, had established himself in Atlanta, working quietly as an attorney advocating for freed slaves during Reconstruction. His position gave him influence, but also constant pressure. Many of the former slaveholders still held power, while the freed population struggled with property disputes, legal recognition, and the lingering weight of systemic oppression. Every case James took became a battle, but he remembered his mother's words to act with courage, even when the odds seemed impossible. Their correspondence became a lifeline. Letters carried stories, advice, and pieces of their shared history. Thomas recounted struggles with prejudice, the obstacles faced by escaped slaves in Ontario, and the small victories of his students. James responded with legal insights, news from the South, and updates about Catherine, who had grown frail but remained mentally sharp, secretly proud that her sons had reunited. In 1872, a letter arrived for Thomas with a subtle urgency. James wrote that a wealthy planter, who had once been a neighbor of Magnolia Creek, was attempting to exploit gaps in the new laws to seize land from freed black families in Georgia. James feared this man might also discover traces of the Bowmont legacy, and he requested Thomas's help to organize the families and protect their property. Thomas understood the stakes immediately. He gathered former students, families, and trusted allies from Chatham and across Ontario, sharing the history of Magnolia Creek and the lessons of resistance Solomon had instilled in him. Together, they developed a strategy: legal defenses, relocation assistance, and community networks to protect vulnerable families from exploitation. Thomas's meticulous planning mirrored the care Solomon had once taken during the rebellion. The summer of 1872 became a period of coordinated effort across borders. Thomas and James worked tirelessly, Thomas guiding the families in Canada and James in Georgia, exchanging intelligence and strategies through letters and trusted messengers. By the fall, their work had thwarted several exploitative schemes, saved families from legal manipulation, and strengthened the sense of agency among those who had once been enslaved. Throughout this time, the brothers began to build a more personal bond. They spoke of their childhoods, James sharing the life Catherine had built for him in Charleston, and Thomas revealing the quiet resilience Solomon had instilled. They mourned the lives of those lost at Magnolia Creek, and the families torn apart, but they also celebrated the lives they had preserved. Catherine watched from afar, tears often filling her eyes, as she read letters from both sons. She had survived the fire, the trauma, and the impossible choices, and now she witnessed the fruits of her sacrifice and Solomon's bravery. She wrote sporadically to Thomas, leaving messages carefully hidden in letters that could be delivered discreetly, reminders of her enduring love and pride. In 1875, the brothers decided to finally meet with families directly affected by the events of Magnolia Creek. They organized a gathering in a neutral location near the Savannah River, inviting survivors, descendants, and community leaders. Around a large wooden table, they shared the truth of the rebellion, the fire, and the courage that had allowed 47 people to escape to freedom. The stories were met with shock, grief, and awe, but also a sense of empowerment. The past, once a source of pain and secrecy, became a foundation for collective strength. It was here, at this gathering, that Thomas and James realized their work was more than familial reunion. It was a mission to ensure that the horrors of slavery, the choices forced by systemic cruelty, and the bravery of those who resisted were remembered and honored. They documented every testimony, every recollection, and every account of survival, creating a record that would outlive them. The brothers also understood the importance of education. Thomas proposed establishing a school that would not just teach literacy and carpentry, but also history, moral courage, and practical knowledge about law and civil rights. James offered legal guidance, funding, and connections to ensure the school could operate safely and sustainably. Together, they envisioned a place where freedom was more than a word. It was a skill, a mindset, and a heritage. Despite the progress, shadows of the past lingered. There were threats from those unwilling to accept black success, whispers of the Bowmont name resurfacing in places best forgotten, and the personal toll of trauma that neither Thomas nor James could fully escape. But they faced these challenges together, brothers bound not just by blood but by the shared responsibility to honor the lives that had been risked and lost. By 1880, the school in Ontario was thriving, attracting the students from Canada and the northern United States. Many of these students were descendants of families who had escaped Magnolia Creek and other plantations, their lives now shaped by the courage of ancestors and the guidance of Thomas and James. The brothers continued their work in law, education, and community building, ensuring that the legacy of survival and resistance endured. Catherine lived long enough to see her sons' reunion and the impact of their work. She passed away quietly in 1891, her final letter to Thomas a testament to her enduring love and guilt, a confession of the impossible choices she had made, and a hope that he had lived a life of freedom and purpose. The story of Magnolia Creek, once defined by fire, betrayal, and secrecy, had transformed into one of resilience, education, and moral courage. Thomas and James had ensured that the lives of the enslaved and the choices of those trapped by circumstance were remembered. They had created a living legacy, a bridge between past and future, and a testament to the power of survival, family, and justice. Even as the world around them shifted, the lessons of that August night choices, courage, and the fragility of power remained. Thomas and James, once separated by birth and circumstance, had reclaimed their history and shaped a future defined not by the cruelty of the past, but by the courage and intelligence of those who had survived it. The legacy of Magnolia Creek was no longer just a tale of horror. It had become a story of survival, defiance, and the enduring strength of human connection. And in that story, the choices of a mother, a father, and a few brave individuals had rippled across generations, shaping lives, communities, and the future itself. By the 1890s, the legacy of Magnolia Creek had evolved from whispered rumors and painful secrets into a tangible force for change. The school Thomas had founded in Chatham had grown beyond its original purpose. What had begun as a small classroom teaching literacy and carpentry had become a hub for black education in southwestern Ontario, offering courses in law, mathematics, agriculture, and civic leadership. Families who had once lived under the constant threat of enslavement now sent multiple generations of children to learn there, each one a testament to survival and resilience. Thomas and James maintained correspondence with each other and with their extended communities in both Canada and the United States. Letters and messengers carried news of new laws, shifting political landscapes, and the slow, uneven progress of Reconstruction. The brothers understood that legal freedom alone was not enough. Knowledge, self-determination, and community were the true keys to survival and dignity. Despite the years that had passed, the shadows of Magnolia Creek occasionally resurfaced. Stories of the fire and the rebellion reached ears far from Mississippi, attracting attention from historians, journalists, and curious outsiders. Thomas and James took care to guide these narratives, ensuring that the focus remained on the courage and intelligence of those who had survived, rather than the cruelty that had spawned the tragedy. In Atlanta, James used his legal expertise to fight predatory practices targeting black families, often drawing on the strategic thinking he had learned from Solomon. He worked tirelessly to prevent land seizures, secure rightful inheritances, and challenge discriminatory laws. Many of these cases were won quietly, through careful negotiation, alliances, and the steady application of knowledge and principle. Every success was a small victory against the systems that had once sought to control and dehumanize his family. Meanwhile, Thomas dedicated himself to mentorship. He trained not only young students but also community leaders, passing down lessons about resilience, planning, and moral courage. He often reminded his pupils that freedom was not a destination but a responsibility. To be free, he would say, is to know your worth, defend it, and protect those who cannot protect themselves. Every choice matters, even the ones that break your heart. The brothers occasionally reflected on the impossible choice their mother, Catherine, had made all those years ago. They understood her sacrifice in practical terms. Splitting them had maximized their chances of survival. Yet they also carried the emotional weight of that decision. They wrote to each other about it, not with resentment, but with empathy, recognizing that courage and love often required choices no human should have to make. As the 20th century approached, the story of Magnolia Creek became part of the local memory, sometimes distorted, sometimes celebrated, but always remembered in fragments. Descendants of those who had escaped, inspired by Thomas and James, carried forward the legacy of literacy, self-sufficiency, and justice. The brothers had created networks that spanned borders, ensuring that the fire that had destroyed the Bowmont plantation became, paradoxically, a spark for enduring freedom. Thomas never learned the full fate of Solomon, though fragments of information suggested that he lived out his life quietly, continuing to aid those escaping slavery. The name, Solomon Turner, occasionally appeared in community records in Ontario, tied to carpentry work, school initiatives, or civic efforts, but the man who had orchestrated one of the most sophisticated acts of resistance in the Deep South remained, in many ways, a figure of legend. James, too, carried forward lessons from the past. He ensured that the Bowmont name, though once associated with cruelty, was quietly transformed in the legal and social circles of Atlanta. He used his status to assist black communities, influence policy, and subtly shift attitudes, demonstrating that justice could be enacted quietly, strategically, and persistently. By 1900, both brothers were respected pillars of their respective communities, their lives intertwined with the lives of hundreds who had survived the violence and upheaval of their early years. Thomas's school continued to thrive, producing graduates who became teachers, tradespeople, and civic leaders. James's legal work had helped countless freed families retain land, secure inheritances, and navigate the often hostile political landscape of the South. Catherine's final letter remained a treasured document, preserved by Thomas as a reminder of both love and loss. He often read it aloud to his students, emphasizing the complexity of human decisions and the resilience of the human spirit. History, he would say, is not only what we inherit, but what we choose to carry forward. Remember those choices, learn from them, and honor the courage it took to make them. As the century turned, the fire of Magnolia Creek, once a symbol of destruction, became, in memory and practice, a symbol of transformation. It had destroyed a plantation, separated families, and forced impossible choices, but it had also revealed the fragility of oppressive systems and the capacity for human ingenuity and courage to prevail. The brothers aged, their bodies carrying the weight of decades of hard work, grief, and determination. Yet they remained mentally sharp, their spirits intertwined with the legacy they had built. Communities in Ontario and Georgia continued to thrive because of their vision, knowledge, and careful planning. And though many of the details of their origins would fade over time, the moral and practical lessons of their lives endured, quietly shaping generations to come. The story of Magnolia Creek was ultimately a story of resilience, intelligence, and the choices that define us. It was a story of a mother who sacrificed, a father who defied ownership to organize freedom, and two sons who reclaimed their destinies. It reminded future generations that even in the darkest nights, courage, love, and careful planning could carve pathways to survival and dignity. And somewhere, in the quiet streets of Chatham and Atlanta, descendants of Thomas, James, and those who had escaped Magnolia Creek continued to live, learn, and thrive, living proof that the choices of a few courageous people could ripple through time, transforming tragedy into legacy and fear into freedom.